Chapter 47. Night changed the forests of Midgard, boldly blanketing everything in countless shades of black. Light blues, cold and distant like the light that encircles the moon, mingled with the shadow's umbra. There were places where greens, so dark as to look black, reached into every crevice, while others, distant and darker, took the shape of trees. The mountains appeared as nothing more than vast clouds that closed in around them from all directions, forcing Kallan and Rune to commit to the winding paths that shaped the valleys with flowing rivers. The rivers were a splendor all of their own, flowing like quicksilver, as black and as smooth as slick strips of louding. Their sheen rippled the reflected moonlight. Kallan and Rune heard the running waters long before they saw them. Tattered and worn with exhaustion, they trudged on. Weariness pulled their muscles and rent their nerves until their eyes burned for want of sleep. Too tired to speak, they walked in silence, saying nothing beyond the spiteful glances they permanently wore through the long night. In darkness they left beyond the last reds of the tundra, unaware that the world had faded to a lush green dappled with various shades of yellow. Beneath their feet the earth softened and their spirits lifted for a short time. Clusters of pine peppered with birch and ash became more frequent, until it widened into vast forests that stretched up the mountain's side. Black peaks silhouetted against the night, obscured the horizon and seemed to forever block their path ahead while enclosing them on all sides. When at last they rounded the final mountain, the valley widened and stretched on ahead for miles, allowing them the first clear view since Jotunheim, but only as far as the night allowed. The gentle pull of the leather reins and soft plod of Astrid's hooves lulled them into a monotonous drawl so that when Rune stopped, Kallan walked into his outstretched arm. "What is it?" she asked, glancing about with the precision of a bird as she grasped the hilt of the sword bound at her side. "Is it them?" The unmistakable scent of freshly turned earth hung in the air as Rune peered through the trees, fighting to make out the shapes in the shadows. He stepped to the edge of the forest, and all at once she understood what he saw just beyond the wood. "No," he said. "They're graves." An infinite number of stones, arranged to outline a fleet of longboats sent out to sea, glowed white in the moonlight. Rows upon rows of stone ships, each one a grave, stretched beyond the mountain's end and spanned the valley. Some of impressive stature had been made of rocks that required the aid of a dozen men to move, while others, most, were small enough to move by hand. But one, the grandest, located in the farthest corner of the field, had been shaped with boulders 5 times the height of a tall man and etched with ancient runes. For several minutes Rune and Kallan gaped, neither speaking as they beheld the magnitude of stones. "There must be hundreds," Kallan breathed as she gazed stunned at their sheer size. "At least," Rune said. With a muffled thump, Rune's satchel struck the ground, averting Kallan's attention from the field. "What are you doing?" she asked. Rune pulled the saddle from Astrid's back. "We've been walking for hours," he explained, dumping the saddle on the ground. "We could be walking for hours more without shelter when we pass through that valley." Rune pulled the furs from Astrid's back. "I want to catch some rest now while we have the trees for cover." "What about them?" Kallan nodded back to the forest behind her, and Rune shrugged. "We've put enough distance between us that we should be able to steal an hour or 2 without interruption." "Well, I don't like it," she said. "Good." Rune dumped his armload into a pile. "Once we've rested up a bit, we'll have the strength to argue." The door of Gudrun's chamber struck the wall, jolting her awake at the table. Through a glassy sheen, and with his hand held to the door, Dagon threw back his head and downed a large mouthful of mead. He drank until his cheeks bulged, holding the mead in his mouth for several moments as his amber eyes peered through the dark glow of the room. The countless nights spent awake dragged his posture down with a weary slump. Only when he released the door did Gudrun realize he had been holding his inebriated self up from the floor. Pink and red gouges scored his face. The hearth popped behind Gudrun, where a large black cauldron brewed something that smelled wonderfully like stew. A small bed shoved up beside the side of the hearth filled the darkest corner. The rose, heather, and mint hanging from the ceiling to dry mixed pleasantly, almost hypnotically, with the aroma of fire, sage, and food. Dagon swaggered and stumbled, catching himself on the wall as he attempted to stand upright. By the degree of his sway, Gudrun concluded he'd been drinking for a while, and the second stage of inebriated babbling was about to begin. "Well, you look a right mess," she said, sitting back in her chair. Dagon gulped down a mouthful of mead with a lavish swig from his flask. With a drunken stupor, he staggered across the room with a sway as Gudrun eyed his arm ring. Dagon fell against the wall beside her table, reeking strongly of black currants, spices, and unwashed man. "Eric's called off the churches," he slurred. "The soldiers have been called back to the city." Dagon threw back another gulp and heaved a rank breath. Round, amber eyes weakened and widened with sorrow. Releasing a long sigh, he let fall his head against the cold stone and watched the fire in Gudrun's hearth beneath the cauldron. "He's leaving her to die out there." Before his eyes could water, he threw back another mouthful, then exhaled. "If she's dead," he said, raising his glassed eyes gaze to Gudrun. "If she's alive, you would know, wouldn't you?" Desperation clung to every word, mercilessly pulling at Gudrun's heartstrings. His nerves were raw with a pang he couldn't dull in a flask of mead, no matter how many times he tried. "Some things are not easy to answer," she said through a sigh. "What I see now can be just as easily changed with a simple choice or "Oh, stop it, wench!" Dagon said. "You know if Kallan said goes out." Gudrun studied the inebriate propped against her wall. The back of her throat burned as she gulped down a knot. "You know Kallan passed from my vision a day after leaving Lorlenalin," Gudrun said. "That I haven't seen anything since." Unable to answer, they shared the silence for a moment before she continued. "If you've come here for answers, then I have none. I know as much as you." "As much as Eric?" Dagon asked. Gudrun raised a brow in question, wondering exactly how much Dagon knew. "He says she's dead," he said. "He prepares a ship." The bite in his words thrust a gloom through Gudrun's power, and he shook his head and added, "He wants my arm ring." The sting bit the tip of Gudrun's nose, and she gulped down the unexpected wave of tears. After another gulp of mead, Dagon pushed against the wall and forced himself into a somewhat upright position. With an added stumble, he shuffled around the table and crouched down beside her. The stench of mead wafted into the air as he breathed, but beneath the mead-glazed stare, a sober desperation stared into the gold of Gudrun's eyes. "Can you really look at me and tell me she's dead?" he asked. Forced to abandon the path of the save, Gudrun mulled her intuition over as she followed the streaks and lines of scarring on Dagon's grizzled face. It was a long wait before she could answer. "No." Gudrun shook her head. "I can't." "Then ride with me." A spark of hope had revived itself in Dagon's voice. "We'll go where the army didn't." Gudrun chuckled at Dagon's spirit and cupped his scarred cheek. "And I suppose we'll ride together to the ends of the earth and on to Gunagiga." Dagon shrugged with a grin. "If you like." "When was the last time you slept, Dagon?" Gudrun said, weary with grief. The captain dropped his eyes to his flask, seemingly unable to think back that far. His hesitation was all the answer she needed. Rising to her feet, Gudrun pushed off the table and listened to the legs of her little wooden chair scrape the stone floor and the shuffle of her own feet. Throwing back his head, he washed down another helping of mead and stood, dragging his drunken self around the hearth. The captain plodded down at the foot of Gudrun's bed. He didn't move when the frail thin hands whipped away his flask and shoved a bowl of thick heavy stew in its place. Another scrape of wood on stone ended with a strong scent of mint as she pulled her chair around and seated herself in front of him. "What of Gunir?" she asked, tugging at her shawl. Dagon didn't budge as she stared into his bowl at the vegetables, chunks of meat and herbs soaked in a brown thick broth. "There's been no word," Dagon said. "And the Dark One?" Gudrun asked. "Has he started looking for his king yet?" Dagon's eyes beamed through the disarray of red hair as he looked up. "No." Dagon shook his head. Nodding, Gudrun sat back in her chair and watched the flames whip the air as Dagon downed the stew in one continuous gulp. Rune took a long draw from his pipe. He released the stream of smoke as he listened to the subtle movement of the warmen watching from the forest around them. Tension rose and he waited, but none of them had made their move. 10. Rune took another draw. They're waiting for something. Silence followed a faint rustling of leaves. Perhaps 11. He released another stream of smoke and slid an eye over Kallan's body. "If I go through with this, it must look convincing." Kallan's chest rose and fell with the steady pace of her breathing. If she doesn't kill me in the process, he thought. A rather convincing bird call broke the silence, but Rune didn't move. A reaction now would trigger an ambush. As if it was only he and Kallan alone in the middle of the wood, Rune snuffed out his pipe and tucked it away in the satchel beside him, as he did any other night. He sat back and tapped a finger on one knee. For the first time since he had pulled Kallan from the caves, she slept without the accompaniment of nightmares. He'd allowed her as much time as he could to let her sleep, and hated himself now for having to wake her, but he'd already lingered too long. May Odin send them all to hell. Pretending he heard no spies, Rune shuffled up into his knees and crawled to Kallan's side. Taking great care not to wake her prematurely, he moved and silently, carefully, positioned himself over the Dolkafar until his body covered hers. He could only hope the image he created would keep them fooled until Kallan woke. Please, Rune held his breath, have the sense enough to listen before lighting my ass on fire. The heat from her body hit him hard and his chest tightened. He leaned closer and fought to keep his head clear as he balanced his weight over her. He could not afford to restrict her movement. She would need the use of her hands. His hair fell forward, blocking their faces from view. He brushed his cheek against hers and found her here with his lips. Kallan, Rune whispered. She smelled of sweet rose and lavender, and he felt his reasoning waning. Kallan, he breathed louder than before. He watched as sleep faded, and Kallan regained consciousness. As she visibly tried to make sense of the situation, Rune pulled his mouth from her ear, and the clouded haze in her eyes passed from exhaustion to bewilderment to panic. The last of confusion cleared, and Kallan slammed her palms against his bare chest. Kallan, Rune whispered again, desperate to draw her attention, and fast. He could feel her heart thundering and watched her face flush red. Panic was taking her. Desperate to shock her into listening, Rune slid his hand over her thigh. As he had hoped, Kallan locked her eyes with his. They're here. His voice was barely a whisper, but he could see she understood. They're watching. He mouthed the words, barely breathing. Where? She asked, matching his whisper. Rune drew himself closer when he could hear the pounding of her chest. In the trees behind me, he answered, and more near the cloak in front of me. Kallan's eyes didn't waver. How many? She asked. At least 10, Rune said. Maybe more. With a look that confirmed she understood, Kallan amassed the scythe in her palm, and the beast stirred hungrily. As if to kiss her, Rune moved, and Kallan reached up and fired a blast over his shoulder into the trees behind him. Before the bodies hit the ground, Rune rolled and snatched his bow too late. An arrow impaled Kallan's shoulder, and she fell to her knees as a soldier landed a blow to the back of Rune's head. Like a swarm, 4 men were on Kallan, grabbing her wrists and arms. They pinned her to the ground, shoving her face into the dirt, while Rune tried to stand, but stumbled when a strike to his back forced him down, and they bound his hands before he could stand. Kallan had gone still. A glazed stare blanketed her eyes, and Rune, with the relentless hunger of the beast within, felt for Kallan's scythe. It slowly drained, not from the core where the scythe began, but from the wound in her shoulder from the arrow's head. Along her scythe lines, he felt her energy fading as if a poison was spreading. Kallan! Rune called. Another blow to the head silenced him. All went black for a moment, then color and light returned. The beast stirred, pacing with great unease, and Rune stretched his senses to Kallan. Despite the dull gaze on her face, within her a mass had formed. Rune felt her push her energy out and force her scythe through the earth. Like a single strand in a tapestry, she wove her energy through the threads inside her captors. Reversing the flow of her scythe, she pulled, drawing the scythe inward and taking with it the scythe around her. Energy from her captors filled her as she drew their scythe from them, pulling on the golden threads only she and Rune could see. Their strength abandoned them, and one by one they weakened their grips, freed her wrists, and fell. Kallan moved to lift herself from the ground, but as the last of the soldiers dropped, Kallan collapsed, caught herself, and tried again to pick herself out of the dirt. The poison was spreading. Wrapping her hand around the shaft, Kallan ripped the arrow from her shoulder with a scream. At once the line of poison that was draining her scythe stopped. Sweat beaded upon her brow, and her hand shook as she withdrew an apple, provoking a new wave of excitement within Rune's beast. The fruit skin had barely grazed her lip when a set of fingers twisted into her hair and pulled her head back. A blade cupped her throat, and Kallan dropped the apple. "Ton! Get the apple!" a warrior cried, and another obediently scooped up the fruit, cradling it like his firstborn. Grabbing the face of the soldier who beheld her, Kallan fired the scythe, propelling his body back. She caught his knife as he fell and threw the blade into the throat of the soldier holding Rune on his knees, and, extending her arms, she blasted the sade from both palms. Two of the last three soldiers fell before either could land another blow, and all was silent. Kallan stood and pulled her dagger from her waist. Heaving, she approached Rune and unsheathed his sword. Nerves unsettled him, and he watched as she flicked her wrist and cut his bonds with her dagger, leaving him to rise to his feet as the Dokafok queen turned to Tarn, who kneeled, cradling the apple, oblivious to the fate of his comrades, ignorant of a Sitkona who tightened her grip on the sword and dagger. Death warmed Kallan's lifeless stare. In 3 long strides she raised the sword, and as cold as a Nordic winter, thrust the blade up and through Tarn's back, lifting him off the ground. With a twist of the hilt, Tarn's body slid from the sword. Only when he hit the ground did he surrender the apple. Blood dripped from the tip of Kallan's blade and pooled on the earth. Ignoring Rune, Kallan retrieved the apple and sank her teeth into its flesh, and Rune watched as the fibers reknitted themselves and exhaustion vanished. The poison receded, leaving her lying strong once more. The forest was quiet. The sunlight had finally come, casting its light from the horizon. Picking himself off the ground, Rune took up an idle sword and calmly brushed the dirt from his trousers. The first of the earliest morning blue spilled into the forest, and he gazed upon Kallan as she finished her apple. With the back of his hand, Rune wiped the blood from his nose, assessed it, then returned his attention to Kallan, who made her way to Astrid and gave of her apple. Rune's eyes glossed with the sheen of a bruise that had already begun to turn the flesh around his eyes black and red. While clutching his stomach, he ambled toward Kallan. He stumbled once and caught himself before continuing on to the Sitkona, who stared across the field in thought. She didn't see the drawback of his arm as he closed in, or his open raised hand seconds before it connected with her face. Seething, Kallan stared through the strands of hair as the red of Rune's palm on her white face vanished almost immediately. "You lied to me," Rune said, clutching his side where someone's boot had landed. His voice carried through the field. "You knew they were after the apples! Why didn't you tell me?" Kallan stared, but preserved his silence, and Rune slammed his hand into her face again. Again her white complexion healed at once, leaving no red, no markings, no sign at all that he had struck her or even felt it. Before she could turn back, Rune swung his sword. Kallan raised Graham and met Rune's blow inches from her face. "Why do they want the apples, Kallan?" Rune asked. Saying nothing, she stared between the blades, locked at the hilts. With a surge of strength, he pushed their swords down, and Kallan raised her dagger to his throat. Cold emanated from the iridescent blue rings of her eyes, and just as quickly as he felt her say the ignite in fury, it ebbed, and indifference moved in and took the fight from her. She lowered her dagger, succumbing to the impassive walls he felt her put up. No sooner had she returned to her dispassionate haze than Rune swung his sword. Kallan sidestepped his attack, but this time he was ready. Closing his hand around hers that clutched the dagger, he shoved her back into the oak and drove her blade into the trunk as he stepped in, pinning her against the tree. "Why did the Devagar take you?" Rune asked, keeping his hand on hers that clutched the dagger. He felt her sade rebound with the fight in her eyes, and she pushed against him. He laughed, encouraging her wrath, and freed her. She pulled the dagger from the tree, poised for battle, but her scythe ebbed once more. Again she lowered her dagger, and the sword turned to her side. Rune swung, and Kallan stepped aside. "I killed your father," he said. "Now hate me!" He swung, and Kallan blocked his blade. "Hate me, Kallan!" The metal rang as she diverted his blade. "Stop blocking my blows!" he shouted. "And hate me!" He struck the blade of her sword, goading her, but she remained impassive and lowered her weapons again. Her indifference only drove him to pursue. Swinging the blade back around, he aimed for Kallan's head, and forced to defend, she caught his blow on the hilt. With a spark in his eye, Rune leaned across their blades and closed his mouth on hers. He felt the sade erupt within her. It awakened the beast that stood and paced hungrily. He bit her lip. Her sade surged, and the beast roared. Rune released her and laughed. Kallan lunged with it, ignited frenzy, evoking a second boisterous laugh from Rune. He dodged her offense with a smile. With his sword, he forced her weapon to the ground and added a hearty chuckle. He felt her temper spark, and undaunted, Rune slipped behind her, sliding an arm around her waist. Aggravating her fury further, he brushed his lips over the back of her neck, ensuring to keep her wrath awakened now that he had it. Rune felt her shudder with ire, and he pushed himself closer, holding her tighter. With a growl, Kallan turned, and as Rune emitted a third laugh, she threw the blades to the ground, ending their game, and pulled her scythe. Rune braced to accept the hit, and absorbed her scythe while the beast roared hungrily in anticipation. A sob rose from the distance. Kallan extinguished her scythe as Rune stood straight, lowering his blade, and they listened. A second cry confirmed their suspicion. Exchanging a quick set of glances, they forgot their quarrel, abandoned their differences, and after Rune snagged up his bone quiver, they sprinted out of the wood together. Over the fresh-turned earth they ran, side by side, into the grave field, slipping in and out to the stone ships, drawn by a woman's cry. At the farmost end of the field, at the edge of a lake, over the graves, they saw a lone soldier and a maiden, there clad in a tunic adorned with Kallan's nod. A soldier sat grinding the girl beneath him. Rage inflamed Rune. Craze awoke the berserker. With his wrath ignited, he pulled, drew, and aimed an arrow, releasing it all before Kallan could summon her scythe. Howling, the soldier arched into the arrow that impaled his back, and taking 3 long strides, Rune raised his sword and swung the blade to the soldier's neck. With a bloody thud, his head fell to the ground, leaving the whimpers of a pale, blonde-haired woman, half-stripped and trembling on the ground beneath the headless corpse.